So now we're going to talk a little bit about emotional and behavioral regulation. It's through the sharing of emotions that we deepen our connections with each other. This really speaks to the fact that what we know about how to behave socially, how to behave emotionally, how to interact with people, and how to create relationship comes from our experience. It comes from how we see other people do it. It comes from how we do it with other people. It's how other people do it with us. And for children who have been traumatized, they often don't have those emotional connections developing or developed, and so they don't then know what to do with all the feelings that they're feeling because they don't have a healthy way to express them. So it's through our emotion that our minds become organized and prepare our bodies for action. This goes back to what we talked about in terms of fight or flight. Something happens to us, we have an emotional response, and that emotional arousal cues us off into what it is that we need to do. So going back to biology, if there's a disconnect between our emotional brain and our cognitive brain, and we have this big emotional response, then our reaction may be very emotional in nature. And because those two sides of our brain aren't talking to each other, that child might not have the ability to then do the stop, think, plan, and act that we would expect them to do when they're faced with some kind of emotionally charged response to something. This is a range of feelings that we sense in ourselves and perceive in others, and how emotion is experienced and communicated may be fundamental to how we come to feel a sense of vitality and meaning in our lives. We are emotional beings by nature. We crave emotional connection. We want it. We want that response from other people. Kids who are living in complex trauma environments, they want that too. But most times they haven't received it. And so then they don't know how to express it, and then they don't know how to go out and get it. And we need to help teach them how to do that. So in terms of emotional development, this is children's feelings about themselves, the people in their lives, and the environment in which they live. Whereas the social development involves learning how to have positive relationships with other people. These are not things that we're born with, folks. These are things that we can teach to. And typically, a child's natural caregiving system as they're growing up is going to be the primary place where they learn how to do this stuff. So if it's not healthy, and it's unpredictable, and it's unsafe, they're not going to be able to learn how to do these things the way kids who are living in healthy environments do. And so then when they come into a more public setting, like a child care center or a school, they haven't necessarily learned these skills. They don't know how to do it. And they may oftentimes, for the first time, be seeing how other people do this in a healthy way. And it may look very foreign and strange to them because we do what we know. We do what our experience is. And so we have to use those environments and the things that are happening in those environments as teaching opportunities for these kids who don't know how to do this and don't know how to get it to learn how to do so. Because just because you weren't born with it, or because you didn't get it as an infant or as a toddler and you didn't see it or experience it until you got into school, doesn't mean you can't learn how to do it. When a parent resonates with the child's emotions, the child's experience of him or herself is that he or she is good. Emotional connections create meaning for the child and affect his or her understanding of both his or her parent and him or herself. We look to our parents or our caregivers or our teachers or our peers or other people that are involved in our life as people that we want to have some kind of emotional connection with. And if the emotional response from that person that we're seeking it from is positive, that's going to affect our sense of competency, and it's going to affect our sense of self-worth. If it's negative, it's going to still affect it. It's just going to affect it in a really negative way. And so we need to find the opportunities where we can create these types of positive connections, because we know we can't always control what's going on in a child's environment at home. It would be silly for us to think that we could. We know that we need to be able to do this work to support our kids, and we know we need to do this work to support the families that these kids are living with, whether it's their natural caregiving system or not. But we don't always have the capacity to go in and change what's happening there. So it's important to find the moments when we can do what we can in whether it's the 1 minute or the 5 minute or the day or the month or the years that we have a relationship with that child to create these positive emotional connections so that they know as they grow and develop how to do those themselves with other people when they have to navigate those relationships later on in life. So how does complex trauma disrupt self-regulation? Kids that have not had the emotional centers of their brain developed are going to have a really hard time being able to recognize and identify their emotions. You see this in kids oftentimes in kindergarten or in preschool when they're talking about feelings. And most of you have seen like the feeling faces chart. These are the kids that when you ask them to draw happy, you ask them to draw sad, you ask them to draw angry, you ask them to draw scared, you ask them to draw embarrassed, you ask them to draw excited. Every face looks the same because they don't know what it looks like. Those messages are so mixed up and confused in their mind that they don't know how to make sense of them. And so when you ask them verbally to tell you how they're feeling, a lot of times they say, I don't know. But if you ask them to try to draw a picture of it or to identify it on a chart, they can't do that either. Identification and expression of emotions is really, really challenging for these kids. They often learn how to behave based on the mood of other people. This goes back to the example that I talked about earlier with the little girl who would base her behaviors on how she heard Dad's car coming up the driveway. Kids are really intuitive and they're really smart and they pay a lot of attention to their surroundings. And so a lot of these kids who have this emotional and social disconnect will not learn how to do things for themselves because everything they do and every step they make is going to be based on what you're doing and how they should react to what it is that you're doing so that they can stay safe. They also have a really hard time using language to communicate their feelings. A lot of this is because at a very early age, kids who are experiencing this early on, their language centers of their brain aren't developing, but finding the words and finding a way to synthesize that information is also really hard for these kids. They have a hard time telling you what they want because oftentimes they don't know what they want because what they want is to get through the day and get to tomorrow. So they don't have this kind of, foresight into, what do you want for Christmas? I don't know. I want to be here. That's what they're thinking. A lot of these kids really lack impulse control. So these are the kids that no matter how hard they try, they just cannot sit still and sit in their chair in the classroom and focus on what's going on around them. They can't do it. Or they have that emotionally charged response to something that's happening, and they might know because we've told them it's not okay to hit, but the emotion comes up and they do this because that's what they know because they can't stop, think, plan, and act. They haven't learned that skill. A lot of these kids, you see aggressive behaviors because it's a means of control. You also see eating disturbances, sleep disturbances. Eating disorders become really common because it's a way, again, to regain control over their world. Okay, I want to move to dissociation now because dissociation is probably one of, if not the key features of complex trauma in how we see it manifesting itself in kids. So dissociation is the failure to integrate or associate information and experience in a normally expectable fashion. This begins as a protective defense mechanism in the face of overwhelming trauma. Now, dissociation can also be adaptive. It becomes problematic when you start using it as a way to navigate through your world. So most of us have probably dissociated at some point in our lives, and you may not have even realized you did it because you weren't calling it dissociation, but how many of you have been in a room and you've just checked out? You're there, but you're not really there. Hopefully none of you are doing that right now. But let's use the example of you're driving to work, or you're driving to school, or you're driving to the grocery store, someplace that you go every day, all the time. How many of you have had the experience where you're driving in your car and you kind of just go on autopilot? And you're doing it because you've done it so many times and you know the route and you know where you're going and you know where the stoplights are and you just get there. And all of a sudden you get to your destination and you go, whoa, how did I get here? Literally, like, I don't remember going through the last stop sign. Did I stop or did I just blow through it? I think most of us at some point or another have had that experience. Well, that's dissociation. And dissociation can be adaptive when you start to think about the ability to be able to check out when you're in an overwhelming situation. It's very, very common for trauma victims to check out of their situation because emotionally it is so completely overwhelming that the only way that they can think of to get through their experience is to check out of it. I'm going to be here, but I'm not going to really be here until this is over, and once it's over, then I'll think about what it is that I need to do to get back to where I need to be. But it can lead to long-term problems when it becomes overutilized as a coping skill, and that's what we see a lot in kids that are in these really chronic and persistent patterns of negative behavior. They just can't deal with their world. They can't deal with anything, and so they learn to just check out, and they start to check out not only in the experience of the traumatic event itself when it's happening, but they start to check out at all sorts of other times, and they're missing a lot of information that's going to help them grow and develop. Okay, so what are the three primary functions of dissociation? The first one is to automate behavior when the experience is too overwhelming. So this is the idea of going through the motions, and you're just going through it, and you don't even realize that you're doing it. This is the kid that goes to school, and they come in, and they go to class, and they sit in their desk, and they pay attention, and they're taking notes, and they're doing this, and you think they're getting it, and they come home from school, and you say, "What'd you do at school today?" "I don't know." "Well, do you have any homework?" "I don't know." "Well, were you there?" "Yeah." "Well, what did your teacher talk about?" "I don't know." They're there and they're going through the motions, and you might not even realize. This is different from the daydreamer. The daydreamer is pretty easy to identify, and the daydreamer may be dissociating too, and that's the kid that's staring blankly out the window that's just, and you're like, "Oh, I'm over here. Come back to us. Oh, hi, welcome back." That kid is really easy to identify. This child is not, because you think they're paying attention and you think they're getting it, and they don't have a clue. And they're doing that because typically these kids can't sit. First of all, they have used up their emotional and their cognitive resources because they're in survival mode. So they're just trying to think about how I'm going to make it through the day. They're probably thinking about what's going to happen after school today, what's going to happen when I get home, what's going to be the mood of mom or dad or grandma or grandpa or whoever I'm living with. Am I going to be safe? And so they're not really focusing. And so it's kind of the example of the Charlie Brown cartoon. So this is the kid that's in the classroom and all they hear is wah, 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 wah. You're talking and they look like they're getting you, but they're not getting you. They're just not there. The second function is to compartmentalize painful memories and feelings. This is the idea that kids become very flat and unresponsive in the face of really, really horrible, scary stuff. The example is the law enforcement agent that comes to a house. There's been a violent incident at the home, and something really, really horrible has just happened. And they come in, they walk in, and the experience quite often for law enforcement is that the kid will be sitting in front of the TV, watching TV or playing video games, acting like they have not been affected at all by what just happened. It's really important to recognize the difference between a resilient child in that case who really hasn't been affected, because that's probably not the case, or the dissociative child who has just completely checked out because what happened was so absolutely horrible that the only way they're going to get through it is to pretend it didn't happen, and they're just not going to be there. They look like everything's fine. That can create huge challenges and problems for engagement into systems that want to help support that child, because on the surface of it, that kiddo might just look like they are fine. Smooth sailing, they're going to go to school the next day, and you're probably not going to have a clue that something really awful happened in that child's home the night before, because they're not going to show it. And then the third is the idea of detaching yourself when confronting extreme trauma, and this happens when you get into typically either the intervention process and folks are recounting their experiences, or for a lot of children who have post-traumatic stress symptoms when they're triggered by something, because a lot of these kids have a lot of triggers, and you might not know what that trigger is. The trigger might be the sound of a car door slamming, or it might be the tone of somebody's voice, or it might be the way you wear your hair that day, or the color of your jacket. All of those things can be triggers for kids that will then bring up experiences that have happened to them, and a lot of times when that happens, they just go, because it's too hard for them to deal with the emotional experience. This typically we see in victims of sexual abuse. So children that have been sexually abused often talk about the fact that they emotionally detach themselves from their bodies. So it's this feeling of, I'm there physically, but I'm not really there emotionally, because it's the only way that they can cope to get through the experience as it's happening. And a lot of sexual abuse survivors then talk as adults about having a really hard time having healthy sexual relationships, because when they engage in something that's supposed to be healthy, all they can do is go back to the traumatic event. And so they literally, it's the conversation of, I'm going to lay there and I'm not going to be here, and I'm going to wait until it's over because it's the only way I can get through it. Even though I know that it's supposed to be okay in this situation, that can be a trigger that then brings this up. And so detaching from their bodies is something that's a very common experience. Okay. And talk a little bit about cognition now. Are we doing okay? Okay. So how does complex trauma disrupt cognition? Lots of ways. And we've talked about a few of them already, but children who are experiencing trauma oftentimes have a real hard time organizing information in a way that makes sense. So we can be as planful and as organized as we want, and a lot of us who are really healthy, who haven't grown up in complex traumatic environments, still have a really hard time organizing information in a way that makes sense. So you can take notes, and you can have your planner, and you can have your calendar, and you can do all this stuff, and we have all these things we have to manage now. And our kids, especially our school-age kids, have a lot of stuff that they need to manage. These kids have not developed the skills or the capacity to organize information in the way that we oftentimes teach them to or expect them to. Some of that could be as simple as not being able to write something down, a list of things that they have to do, and then get it to their final destination so they can do it. Some of it has to do with learning and teaching styles. Some of these kids are very, very verbal, and if they see the information, it just looks like a jumbled mess to them and they don't understand it. Other kids can do very well if it's written, but when you're talking to them in front of the class, they have no idea what's going on because they can't synthesize the information that way. So you have to think about learning styles of children, how they're taking in the information, trying to create opportunities for various forms of teaching and teaching opportunities for these kids, because not all our kids learn in the same way anyway, and then you throw trauma into the mix and it makes it really challenging. Developmentally, a lot of these kids have this, they live in a fantasy world, and they start to have this notion that some superhero is going to come and rescue them and save them, and they are looking for a rescuer. This is really common in kids where that kind of logic and the idea to reason hasn't been developed, and so they live in kind of fantasy land, and they think that somebody's just going to come and swoop down and save them. A lot of these kids can't link the cause and effect, and so what happens is they experience an event, and there's a lot of self-blame that happens. They think that what they did or what they didn't do often was the cause or the source of whatever their experience was. And they get very confused by the messages that we send them. And this we've seen in several of the domains thus far. So what are you telling me versus what I hear versus what I see versus what I experience? That is a big jumbled mess for these kids, and it's really hard for them to make sense of it. And a lot of these kids are still pretty egocentric, so they attribute the violence that's happening to them. If I would have done something different, if I would have just done this, if my room would have just been a little bit cleaner, then this wouldn't have happened. That kind of experience is very, very common. I think the other one that I probably would want to emphasize, especially for the educators in the room, is the issue of difficulty in organizing and remembering new information. This may be a very, very simple task that you're trying to teach this child, but for them to get it from where you are to where they are, and then have the ability to remember it and to be able to regurgitate it back is really hard. And to not only tell you what it was, but then to be able to do it is even harder. And you'll remember when we talked about biology, we're talking about underdeveloped language centers of the brain. We're talking about memory being inhibited. And so being able to do this kind of rote memory kind of task where you tell them something and then they learn it and then they repeat it back to you is really, really hard for these kids. And that goes directly into understanding cause and effect, because you can tell them 20 million times that you do things this way, and they're going to do it this way. And you can tell them, and then they do it, and then they get in trouble, and let's say you discipline them for it, and then they can tell you back, well, I know it's not okay. But they're acting out of the emotional side of their brain, and so you're going to see those behaviors repeating themselves over and over because they can't make the connection between, if I do X, Y is going to happen. And you can tell them, and they can tell you that they know that that's going to happen, but then 5 minutes later, they do X and Y happens. And then you tell them, no, it's not okay, you don't do it this way, you do it this way. And they say, okay, I understand. And then 5 minutes later, they do it again. How many of you had that experience with a child? It happens a lot because this has not been developed for them. They don't understand how to do it. So we have to use those as teaching opportunities and teachable moments for our kids where we can start to then create a dialogue and create a relationship where they can understand that, one, it's safe, and two, it's adaptive, and we have to model that for them all the time. And we can be modeling this stuff constantly, and it can make a big difference. All right. Self-concept. So when we talk about self-concept, we're talking about the whole inner picture that somebody has of himself or herself, including a complete evaluation of such traits as competence, worth, and attractiveness. This is how we view ourselves. This is how we value ourselves as human beings. This is how we internalize the responses that people give to us. This is all about how we feel valued as a person. So what can trauma do to disrupt self-concept? It can do a lot. Children need to be able to anticipate their consequences. They need to learn how to set goals. They need to learn how to carry them out in order to be successful. But when a kid has a poor sense of self-concept and oftentimes then a shortened sense of future, they don't get the opportunity to learn how to do things like develop competence in their self, develop skills that will help them be successful, or develop a sense of self-worth, because their lives are spent from moment to moment learning how to act or learning how to react instead of learning how to plan. These kids have never had that experience before. And so when you're constantly having to react to the world around you, like I had said earlier, you don't get the opportunity to stop and go, oh, wait a minute, plan for my future? I mean, and we see these kids a lot in middle school and high school where you ask them what their goals are or what they want to do when they grow up or where they see themselves in 5 years, and they just look at you with this blank look like, what are you talking about? It's not because they don't want to have goals or they don't want to have a future or they don't want to be successful. It's because nobody has taught them how to do that. They haven't learned the skills how to do that, and they haven't had the experience of anybody telling them that they were valued enough that they could actually contribute something to be successful. So they don't even know where to start. And so with these kids that have poor self-concept, we have to go all the way back to the beginning, and we have to start validating their experience, validating who they are, making them feel like they are worth something, because all of our kids are worth something. They're worth a lot, and that's why all of you are here, is because you're invested in making sure that our kids are healthy and successful. So we need to make sure that they know that, because it's not enough that we know that. They have to know it, they have to understand it, and they have to believe it. And kids who have been traumatized in these kind of persistent patterns, they don't understand that. They don't know it. Nobody's ever told them, and it hasn't been their experience. A lot of these kids feel very hopeless, and they feel a foreshortened sense of future. There was a study that was done with some first graders who were kidnapped on a school bus. Their school bus was basically hijacked. And they came out of it okay, and nobody was injured. And several years later, they did a follow-up study with these kids who were in first grade about their experiences on the bus. And one of the questions that they asked these kids was about their future and where they saw their future going, where they saw their lives as adults. And there was not a single child that had that experience that was on the bus that could tell the interviewer anything about what their life might look like beyond the age of 18. Because not a single kid that was on this bus thought they were going to live to see adulthood. So when you asked them about it, they were lost. They had no idea what you're talking about. And they didn't know how to frame what a future might look like, because in their mind, their future ended that day. That was it. The thing to take away from that is, aside from the fact that it's really, really sad, is that this was a single traumatic event. This was an acute event that happened to these kids who all came out of it okay, physically. And they had no sense of what their future was going to look like because they didn't think they were going to have one. So you can imagine a child who is living in this chronic, traumatic environment, who is just trying to get by from day to day to survive, is probably not going to be thinking about taking their SATs or what college they want to go to or what they want to be when they grow up, because they don't know if they're going to get the opportunity to grow up. And so we have to start teaching these kids how to build those skills so that they learn that they are valued and that they do have something to contribute and that they can learn to plan for their futures, because they can have a future. Low self-esteem, obviously, is really prevalent in kids who have experienced complex trauma and a diminished sense of self-worth. And a lot of that goes back to the guilt and shame that also comes along with this, and feeling like they are somehow to blame for the events that have happened to them. These kids think that they've done something wrong. And it doesn't matter how much we tell them that they didn't. It's not your fault. It's not your fault. Don't stop saying it, because these kids need to know that it's not their fault. But just because you say it doesn't mean that they're going to believe it the first time they hear it, or the 20th time they hear it, or the 150th time they hear it. We have to keep enforcing it with them. I mentioned earlier, a lot of times we see eating disorders. Eating disorders are very common in kids who have been traumatized chronically, because it's a way to regain control over their bodies and over themselves. And then finally, they're really unsure of how to get their needs met. A lot of these kids don't know what their needs are, let alone how to go about getting their needs met. And it's because they've spent their lives queuing off of other people. They don't really have needs, because their need is to survive. And so they learn how to behave based on how other people around them are acting and behaving. And so they don't get to really know what they want. And that's why a lot of times you see these kids that you ask them, what do you want? I don't know. Or they say nothing, because they don't know. Not only do they not know what their needs are and what they want and how to get their needs met, but they don't know how to express it either. Okay. How many of you have read the book A Child Called It, or are familiar with it? Okay, so most of you have. Probably one of the most gruesome child abuse cases in the state of California's history. And the book, for those of you that don't know it, is a biography about a man named David Peltzer, who experienced some of the most horrific abuse that I've ever heard of, from the time he was about 5 years old until the time he was 12, and was finally removed from his home and placed in the foster care system. And this is a quote from the book, not only talking about his diminished self-concept and sense of self-worth, but also I want to speak to the fact that this was a very, very resilient young man. At night I no longer dreamed, nor did I let my imagination work during the day. The once vibrant escapes of watching myself fly through the clouds in bright blue costumes were now a thing of the past. When I fell asleep, my soul became consumed in a black void. I no longer awoke refreshed. I was tired and told myself that I had one day less to live in this world. I shuffled through my chores, dreading every moment of every day. With no dreams, I found that words like hope and faith were only letters, randomly put together into something meaningless, words only for fairy tales. This was a child that had no sense of who he was. He was not valued as a person, as a human being. His mother, the book is called A Child Called It because at one point during his cycle of abuse with her, she no longer would refer to him as David or as her son. She referred to him as it, the boy. She disconnected herself from him. And it's an amazing story of resilience. For those of you that haven't read it, I really would encourage you to do so, because it sounds like such an awful, awful book and an awful story. But he actually came out of this. He was a very resilient child and ended up going on, graduating from high school, joining the Air Force, becoming a very decorated officer, and having a very successful life with a family and kids of his own. And that doesn't mean that these experiences didn't impact him, because they obviously did, and they're obviously going to shape who he is now as an adult. But he has been able to tell his story of survival. And I think it's a message of hope for all of us, that a lot of times we get so wrapped up in some of the most horrible things that we're seeing that are happening to our kids that we go straight to the worst case scenario. This child is never going to survive this, because it is so awful, and I can't even imagine what it would be like to live in their shoes. I mean, this is a man who was forced to drink bleach. He was forced to eat feces. His mother stabbed him and was going to let him bleed to death because she refused him medical treatment. I mean, you think about the really, really, really bad things that you're seeing in these kids, and then you take it and you magnify it. And that's what this child was going through. And as an adult, he has been able to overcome those odds and be one of these super resilient kids that we talk about that makes it. And I think we need to recognize that this could be any of our kids that we're working with. And we have a role that we can play in their lives to support them so that they can be resilient, so that they can overcome. And we need to remember, especially for a lot of us that are in this room, the kids that we're coming into contact with often have already been exposed to the child welfare system. They're involved in some way. Well, we talked earlier about the 25-75% and the fact that only 25% of our kids are ever reaching a formal system. So the kids that you're seeing have to have some pretty awful stuff going on just to get their foot in the door to be acknowledged. And how many of those kids are still out there among the 75% that we don't know about, that are experiencing the same things, that aren't getting the support that the kids who are in the system are getting? And what can we do to try to find ways to support those kids? Because one, we don't want them to have to enter a formal system before they get support, but we also don't want to lose them, because the kids that are in the system, they've been engaged, and they have a chance right now, because they're involved with a lot of people that want to do really good things to help them. But they might be sitting in a classroom next to a child who's going through the same experiences, and we don't know who they are, and they haven't been identified. And we need to pay attention to that when we're looking at all of these kids. And this is not to, I think, overemphasize the trauma fact and the potential experience. I mean, we don't want to get catastrophic about it and start assuming that every kid that we come into contact with may or may not have been traumatized. And we don't want to start to assume that all our kids are trauma victims. But the beauty of this approach and creating a trauma-sensitive understanding and framework for how we're dealing with these kids is everybody can benefit. It doesn't matter if you're a trauma victim or not. Who can't benefit from the idea of being recognized and valued and validated and supported and having some kind of positive relationship being created? I mean, we all want that, whether we're a trauma victim or not. And so this approach can then benefit everybody, and you can do it without having to know what systems they are or aren't involved in, what their experience was, what happened to them yesterday or last week or last month, because all it will do is have a positive impact. Okay. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about treatment and interventions. And there are a lot of interventions that are out there, and there's a lot of research behind some evidence-based practices that really work well with trauma victims. And they're very specific to people that have been, obviously, that specialize in trauma, that have been trained to do the interventions, and all of those are in the full packet. But what I really want to focus on is the fact that all of us, regardless of what profession we're in and regardless of what role we have with kids, can play a part in supporting them. We know that effective interventions for trauma in children and adults are available. New stuff is coming out all the time. And there's always research that's being done, and there's always something else that's being discovered. And so we want to pay attention to that, and we want to be educated to it. We also want to know what's available in our communities and what are the places where we can provide additional support for kids who are victims. But we know that most of us are going to have a relationship with a child that's not going to necessarily be on a professional level. They might be a family member. They might be a child that we see in the neighborhood. They might be someone that goes to our church. They're definitely going to be the kids that are in our schools. So what can be the role that we play as a natural helper to create the things that are going to increase protective factors, that are going to buffer these kids against the experiences that they're having, that are going to foster resiliency in them, that are going to create competencies and a sense of self-worth and a sense of value in our kids so that they can start to overcome the experiences that they're dealing with. Because so few people reach professional care, our social response to trauma will always first be through natural helpers. This is really important to recognize. There are a lot of these families that won't go and seek out help because there's stigma associated with it. There are a lot of families that want to seek out help and seek out support, but because of very narrow legal definitions and because of issues of things like insurance and eligibility and access to care, a lot of them that really want it can't get it because they don't fit this criteria. And so there are a lot of reasons why families don't engage. There's a lot of stigma placed on parents. There are a lot of parents that know that there are things that they could be doing differently or things that they want to do better, but they don't go because they don't like the finger pointing that happens a lot of times in our professional systems. And that is disappointing and it's sad, but it's also the reality, especially if you have a parent that is perpetrating against a child. It's really hard not to point your finger and go, what do you think you're doing? We have to remember that these parents, quite oftentimes, are doing what they know as well. And most of our parents and our families of kids who are growing up in complex traumatic environments grew up in those same complex traumatic environments themselves, and so they also didn't learn the skills. They also didn't have the support. They didn't learn how to do it differently, and so they're doing the best with what they've got, and we need to find ways to support our parents, because it's not going to do a whole lot to help support the kids if we're not looking at the perspective that they're coming from and trying to help them through whatever it is that they're going through as well. Okay. So some of the things that complicate these cases, we've talked about the narrow legal definition, scope and definition of child abuse. This is a tough one. This is something that we see in every state across the country because we don't have the capacity in our professional systems to reach every child who is being victimized. We don't have the staffing, we don't have the resources, so it becomes an issue of prioritization. Well, how do we prioritize? We create very, very strict definitions of what constitutes child abuse and neglect, and then we follow those, and there are procedures. And that allows some kids to get in the door and other kids not to get in the door. That doesn't mean that what's going on with those kids that we don't see isn't just as bad and doesn't deserve equal attention, but we have to frame it somehow because we can't get to everybody. That's where the role of natural helpers becomes so important because, again, 75% of the kids that have this stuff going on don't ever get their foot in the door. So we have to find other ways of supporting them. Conflict and mistrust between professionals. Those of us that are working in systems, we know that the best thing for these kids is to collaborate. It's to work together. It's to communicate. It's to find links between the education system and the mental health system. It's to find ways that parents and families don't have to jump through 2,500 hoops to get the services or the supports that they need. It's finding ways to talk about it that makes sense. The reality of the situation is we don't always play nice together. And it's not because we don't want to, but a lot of times we have barriers within our own systems and within our own structures that don't allow us to do the work that we really want to do, that we know is best for these kids. And some of it has to do with definition, some of it has to do with the resources, some of it has to do with people being territorial, some of it has to do with intervention. And so we have all of these kids that then get treated within their silos that don't get that full picture. And we don't get the full picture because they go over here for their substance abuse stuff, and they go over here for their mental health stuff, and they go over here for their education stuff, and they go over here for their family work, but they go over here for their individual work. And we can't find a way. And part of that is because we all look at what we know. And so we frame our approach based on our own experiences and our backgrounds and what we know and what we think is going to help. Reframing this from a perspective of trauma breaks down a lot of those barriers, because whether a child is in the education system or the juvenile court system or the mental health system or in the substance abuse system or not in any system at all, if their experience is one of complex trauma, it's one of complex trauma, and it's one that everybody can understand. And if we're going back to looking at not just treating the symptoms and then sending the child back to their environment, but looking at the root cause of what's going on, looking at it from a foundational perspective, and trying to then essentially rewire the experiences of these kids in a much more adaptive way, then all of a sudden we have a frame of reference that we can talk to each other about that makes sense. Mistrust between parents and professionals is something that happens a lot too, and this goes back to kind of the finger-pointing stuff that we all at some point have probably done, even though we don't like to admit it, or the judgments that we place on parents that we don't always like to admit that we do, but we've probably done at some point in our careers or in our lives. A lot of times professionals are seen as the bad guys because we're here to help those kids. And the parent oftentimes doesn't feel supported in that process. A lot of times they feel very shut out, and we have to find ways to communicate and collaborate and partner with our parents, regardless of their experience, because we need them to be as allies if we're going to work to support these kids. And then, of course, there's the notion of pathology and dysfunction. A lot of people don't try to seek out support because they don't want a label slapped on them. I don't want to look like I'm crazy. I don't want to look like I've done something wrong. I don't want to have to admit that I don't know what to do. So then they don't seek it out. And we have to try to break down those barriers as well and create more supportive, welcoming environments for our families so that they don't feel stigmatized, so they don't feel like there's something wrong with them, or they don't feel like they're a bad person because the experiences that they had as a child led them to the experiences that they've had now as a parent, which may not be the best experiences for their child. We can change that, but we have to do it in a supportive way. So some of the things that we can all do, and this is really important, especially in the education system, and I keep going back to schools because that's where these kids are going. And it's one of the places where I think educators, one, have not been given the information, and two, they certainly have not been supported in how to do this. We have to create an infrastructure where our educators can feel supportive to start building the bridges and creating the relationships with these kids in a way that's going to have an impact and that's going to make a difference. But we know that there is a huge burden on our teachers right now. We know that there's issues about the WASL, and everybody's talking about the WASL right now, and our kids have to pass the WASL so that they can graduate from high school. And so there is tremendous amount of pressure on our teachers right now to do what they do academically. And what happens is these kids then come into their classroom and they're not prepared to focus on learning. They're not prepared to focus on studying for the WASL or, God forbid, actually taking the test. Because if they can't even get through the day and they can't focus on their learning and all they're doing is trying to survive and they don't think they have a future and they have no sense of who they are, then the WASL isn't very important for these kids. and they're probably not going to do very well because they're probably not learning the material because they don't have the cognitive capacity to do so because they're expending all their energy focusing on other things. So then they come in and they start acting out. That makes it really, really challenging for a teacher who has lots and lots of objectives about making sure that excuse me, their school's meeting progress, that it's really easy to then target that child and say, okay, well, this child is disruptive. I can't have this child in my classroom because it's disruptive for everybody in the classroom and it's disruptive for me as the teacher. So we have to find different ways to look at these kids, and we have to find ways to do things like earn the trust of the parent. You have to start to have the conversation about what's going on. This doesn't mean that you have to do assessments or that you have to be a researcher or an investigator and start getting all the details about what's going on. But if you notice that something's going on with a child, the best thing you can do is to call it what it is and identify it and start to talk about, or at least think in your own mind about what might be going on for that kiddo that's causing him to act or react the way that they're doing. We need to earn the parent or the caregiver's trust. We can't do this without our parents. We need to establish a context in which the parent has some element of choice. What this means is we can't push our own agenda just because we think we know what's best for these kids. Because oftentimes, the parent or the caregiver is going to be the best source of information for us as helpers. We have to try to engage them, even if it's very limited in our capacity to do so. We have to be able to engage them and find out what's going on. Allow them to tell their story at their pace. Frame parents' intentions positively. I don't think there's a single parent that's out there that has ever said, you know what, I think I want to be a really horrible parent. I think I want to abuse my kids and limit their opportunities, and I don't want them to be successful, and I want them to have a really crappy life. I'm being a little sarcastic, but our parents don't do that. They grow up trying to make the best of the situation that they're involved in, and a lot of times we lose sight of that. They've had their own set of experiences that have shaped who they are. And it's quite oftentimes because nobody gave them the skills or the tools, or they didn't create the relationship to understand how to do it with their own kids. But you know what? Now they have their own kids. And we need to figure out how to break that cycle. Well, we're not going to do it by shutting the parents out and telling them that they don't have a voice or they don't have a choice or that they're crappy parents. Because they're just doing what they know. And we have to find ways to support them so that as adults, they can start to learn how to have healthy relationships as well. It may be that they're in a place where they're not safe to parent their kids. That happens. We know that's a reality. But just because they can't be parenting their kids right now doesn't mean that we shut them out and then we don't support them. Because you know what? They still have a lot of stuff going on. And we need to find out ways that we can help build those positive skills in our adults as well as in the kids that we're working with. All right. So working with kids, safety, safety, safety. I can't emphasize enough how important it is that you have to make sure the child is physically safe before you do anything. Because if you don't guarantee their safety, they're not going to listen to you anyway. They're not going to go where you want them to go. They're not going to follow your agenda because they need to feel like you're an okay person and this is an okay place for them. So you have to earn their trust and you have to make sure that they're safe. These are things that research has shown are very effective, and these are things that all of us can do, whether we are in a formal system or in an informal system, whether we're a professional, whether we're a paraprofessional, whether we're a family member, whether we're a neighbor. It doesn't matter. These are all things that we can do. Anything that you can do to enhance positive, healthy attachments with these kids is going to be critical because we know they're not always getting it and developing it at home. So what can we do to create relationship and frame relationship that it can be a positive thing and it doesn't have to be something that's scary and that you have to avoid? Providing praise. Very important. These kids need to know that they're valued and that they're good and that they have something to offer. Selective attention. This one's kind of hard sometimes, especially when you've got really disruptive kids, but we have to look for opportunities that we can seize and take and do something positive with. And so often it's really easy for us to focus on the negative behavior, and we've become, as a society, and in most of our systems, so punitive in the nature of our discipline practices that instead of looking for the moments where we can reward the positive, we always go to how can we reduce the negative. So then we become very, very focused on the negative. And sometimes one of the best things that you can do, obviously if it's not an issue of safety, if it's something that's irritating and annoying, just maybe ignore it once. Don't emphasize it. Don't draw attention to it. And then you look for the opportunities where that child is doing something positive, and you seize them and you emphasize them. And maybe it's only 5 seconds out of a 6-hour day that happens, but you take those 5 seconds and you grab onto them and you emphasize the heck out of that 5 seconds. Wow, that was amazing. Did you see how you did that? A lot of times these kids don't know, and they are so focused themselves on being reprimanded that they don't realize that they even did anything that was notable. And so you have to look for those moments, and you have to take hold of them at every opportunity you can get. And those are some of the most positive things that we can do to encourage our kids. That goes right along with providing positive reinforcement. This is a really easy thing to do. And again, with our behavior kids, this sometimes is one of the most challenging things for us to do as adults, because we're so focused on reducing the negative behavior that we get focused on waiting for the next negative thing to happen so that we can be like this. That's not okay, that's not okay. Well, that's not going to help them. They need to know when they're doing things well and when they're doing things that make other people around them feel good and that are really positive, because a lot of times these kids don't know what that looks like. So we have to actually physically identify it for them. Wow, that was a really great thing you just did. Did you see how I could tell you were feeling really angry, but you didn't hit Johnny? That was really great. Wow, what was going on for you? And start to engage in a conversation about what that might have felt like for that child. Those are really great teaching opportunities for these kids, and they can be little tiny things. Being able to model relaxation techniques, this is that kind of stop, think, and act. If you can start to model some of these behaviors, and these are, again, very, very subtle things that you can be doing throughout the course of your day that sometimes you don't even realize you're doing. Like, let's say you're really frustrated with a kid that you're working with or that you're living with, and you're really, really frustrated, and you have to stop and you kind of, or you walk away for a second, or you stop and you count to 10. To be able to identify for that child what it was that you just felt, that you experienced, and what you did to manage what you were feeling is a really, really great teaching opportunity for these kids, because a lot of times we just do it because we do it and we know it's what we have to do to get through the moment. But nobody's ever taught them that, and they haven't experienced it, so they're in reaction mode. So if you can stop and call it what it is and identify it for them and say, wow, you know what? I was really frustrated right there, but this is what I did, and this really helped me. And these are things that you can do when you're feeling that way too. A lot of times we take that stuff for granted, and we think that our kids just know how to do this stuff, but nobody's ever taught them. And then that goes right along with providing teaching opportunities for emotional and behavioral regulation. We know how to regulate our bodies, and we know how to regulate our thoughts and our emotions, but a lot of these kids haven't ever been taught. They haven't had those skills developed in them. So when we're doing it, we can do things as simple as identifying what it is and then explaining it to them, showing them, demonstrating it, modeling it, providing positive self-talk, and promoting problem-solving skills. Remember, these kids, they don't know how to plan. They don't know how to problem solve. They know how to react. So we have to teach them what we mean when we say, well, how would you solve that problem? I don't know. They look at us like we're talking a different language sometimes. We have to make sure that they understand what it means when we're talking, that they understand what it is that we're saying, that they're on the same page with us, and then show them, walk them through the process. A lot of these kids won't go through this problem-solving process because they just expect somebody else to do it for them. Somebody's going to tell them what to do anyway, so you do it. I don't know how, you figure it out. And a lot of times with kids with really challenging behaviors, it's a lot easier for us to just do that. It's a lot easier for us to just figure it out. Okay, well, I'll just do it for you. You do it this way. Well, if we don't show them, they're never going to learn the skills to be able to do it themselves. Okay. The research tells us that there are 3 basic features that are common to all competent children. And these are things that we want to identify in our kids and promote the development of, because they're going to help buffer them against all of these negative things that are happening to them. The first one is a strong parent-child relationship, or when such a relationship doesn't exist, a surrogate caregiving figure who serves a mentoring role. We can all do this. We can all be that person for these kids, because what we know is the power of relationship is so great that if they're not getting it over here, they certainly can get it over here, and that can make a big difference. The ability to self-regulate attention, emotions, and behaviors. We can all do this in our natural systems, regardless of what environment we're in. We can help support our kids. But we have to look at how we can create the infrastructure to do this. It's really easy to say, okay, all you educators, go out and do these things. Because now you've got the information, you've got the tools. Well, what we have not done, we're not creating another toolkit for you. We're not creating a curriculum. We're not creating another have-to in response to an unfunded mandate. This is an approach. It's a way of thinking about the experiences of our children and looking at things in a little different way when we're encountered with some of the challenging behaviors that we see in our classroom or in our homes or in our systems. It's being able to stop and take a step back and go, you know what? I don't really know the big picture with this kid. But you know what? That's okay, because I don't need to know. It's not about my need to know the information. It's not about my need to tell their story. We need to allow them to share that stuff at their own pace when they're ready. But regardless of whether or not we know what's really going on for these kids, we can still be in a supportive relationship and not be punitive and not allow ourselves to be in a position where we're looking at them from the negative instead of from the positive. And then finally, good cognitive skills, which predict academic success and lead to rule-abiding behavior. This is where there's potentially the greatest impact from reframing the way we look at and perceive and respond to these kids in our education system, because our kids that are experiencing this stuff are not going to succeed academically if we can't support them socially, if we can't support them emotionally, if we can't give them the skills and the understanding of how to navigate relationships and navigate through their environments so that they actually can focus on going to school and learning. Because right now, they're not so focused on going to school and learning. They're focused on surviving. So how can we start to reframe their world for them so that they can understand, one, that this is important and it's going to have value and it's going to get them someplace because they're going to be successful, but that we can then give them the tools to help them build those skills internally so that they can learn how to do it themselves. There are several promising practices that are out there. This is a list of them. So for kids who are involved in systems, these are techniques that work really well. And we go into a lot more detail about what the evidence-based practices are and what research says about them in the full packet. But the bottom line is it all comes down to relationship. And that's why you guys are here. That's why I'm here. It's about understanding that creating relationship doesn't have to be a difficult thing. And just because kids have experienced these really horrible things doesn't mean that there's no hope for them. And that at any stage of their development, even on into adulthood, that we can be the people that create the relationship with these kids. And that, yes, one person actually can make a difference. And the fact that one child who's experienced complex trauma has one person in their life, and it might be a neighbor, and it might be a teacher, or it might be a counselor, or it might be a friend, or it might be a relative, or it might be a foster parent, that actually cared enough to listen to who they are and validate their experiences and help support them, can be enough. But we have to know that most of these kids have not been identified and we don't know who they are, and we may not ever know who they are. So by actually reframing our approach and treating every kid as they should be, with dignity and respect and being valued, is going to go a long way. Keep in mind that trauma is a reaction to an external event. Trauma is not about the event itself. It's about how we respond to whatever it is that we're experiencing. So something that is traumatic to one person in the audience may not be viewed as traumatic by the other person, because it's not about what exactly is going on for that child. It's about how they're responding to that event that makes it traumatic. So just because you think that something shouldn't be traumatizing doesn't mean that the behavior and the experience of that child shouldn't be validated, and that we shouldn't have a sense of understanding that if they're telling us that it was really awful, then it probably really was. It's not always possible or appropriate to discover whether a child's learning relationships and behavioral difficulties are trauma responses. We talked about this earlier. Not all kids that exhibit these behaviors are traumatized, and not all kids that don't exhibit these behaviors are not traumatized. So we can't make broad generalizations. That's why reframing our thinking and our approach to how we deal with behavior, regardless of what setting we're in, is so important. And that children are often having normal reactions to not okay things. So I want to end with a quote and let you know that we, I think, have an ethical and a moral obligation to address these things as issues, because once again, all of this is 100% preventable. Our kids do not have to be going through these experiences, and if they are, there are a lot of things that we can do to support them and respond to them in healthy ways so that they don't have to continue going through their childhood, experiencing and reliving those experiences. We know that there are huge costs associated with doing nothing, and if the financial figure didn't really emphasize that, I think we know that there are not only financial costs but huge emotional costs as well, and societal costs by sitting back and not doing everything, and that's why you guys are here today. And that we have to find ways for our systems to talk to each other and for us to partner and to collaborate, because we can't operate in our silos. It's not helpful to these kids. It doesn't benefit them. And that there are lots of things that all of us can do, regardless of what our role is, that can make a difference. And we have to value ourselves and value the role that we're in, and know that that actually can make a tremendous impact. So not realizing that children exposed to inescapable, overwhelming stress may act out their pain, that they may misbehave, not listen to us, or seek our attention in all the wrong ways, can lead us to punish these children for their misbehavior. If we only knew what happened last night or this morning before she got to school, we would be shielding the same child that we're now reprimanding. You guys want to hear about John? Okay. So, John is the oldest of 4 children. John goes home every night to an alcoholic father and a drug-abusing mother. He picks up his younger siblings on his way home from school. He often walks through the door to find his mother passed out on the couch. When they get home, he sends his siblings to the kitchen to start their homework, and he'll often coax his mom into the bedroom so his siblings won't have to see her that way. Then he starts dinner and laundry so they'll have clean clothes for school tomorrow and they'll be able to eat. He gets all of this done before Dad gets home. When Dad gets home, depending on the night, he and Mom either get high together or they end up fighting, and they end up violent, and Mom ends up getting injured pretty badly. When the fighting starts, John takes his younger siblings out of the house for a walk or down to the basement to sleep. This usually results in him not sleeping to ensure that they're safe. Because of this, he hardly has time for homework, and he usually is too tired to stay awake in class. This is a real kid. This was his real experience. My hope is that going through this process reframed some of the assumptions that we all have about those kids that we come into contact with, because we always jump to the conclusion about the behavior and why it is that kids are acting the way that we're acting, and we often don't take a step back to think about what might be really going on. Thank you.